Okay, so we can start the class. I would like. Is the PPT visible? Can you see the PPT?
Yes, ma'am. We can start.
Okay, okay. So in the last class, we discussed till Clint I.A. Richard's 4 kinds of meaning. And in today's class, we will be discussing Clint Brooks, the language of paradox. So in this particular essay, The Language of Paradox, Clint Brooks was talking about the importance of paradox and metaphor in poetic language. And he tries to establish that language of paradox is language of poetry. So he's bringing a connection between language of paradox and language of poetry. First, let's look about Clint Brooks. Clint Brooks is one of the greatest new critic. His contemporary, he belongs to the new criticism, and his contemporary was J.C. Ransom, John Crow Ransom. And John Crow Ransom describes him as the most powerful and influential critic of poetry that we have. So, he is considered to be the most powerful and influential critic of poetry in the new criticism movement. He was one of the key figures in the rise of new criticism in America in 30s and 40s. In 1930s and 1940s, new criticism emerged in America, and Clint Brooks was one of the key figure who played an important role in the rise of new criticism. He is also a member of a prominent figure of fugitive group or Southern Agrarian. There is this group called fugitive group, and they are also called Southern Agrarian, and he belonged to that group also. The other critics of his period or other critics of the groups include J.C. Ransom, Alan Tate, Robert Penn Warren. These are some of the contemporaries and other critics who belong to the new criticism as well as fugitive group. The textbook anthologies edited by Brooks and Warren, Understanding Poetry, which was published in 1938, and Understanding Fiction, which was published in 1943, brought about revolution in the art of teaching literature. So remember the name of these books, Understanding Poetry and Understanding Fiction. These are 2 anthologies edited by Clint Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. These are the 2 important textbooks. Understanding Drama is another book which was written in collaboration with Robert Haleman. So when you study about Clint Brooks, remember the name of his works. The important works to be remembered are Understanding, which was written in collaboration with Robert Penn Warren. Understanding Fiction, written in collaboration with Robert Penn Warren. Understanding Drama, which was published in 1947.
Some disturbance are there, ma'am.
Was written in collaboration.
Ma'am, your voice is not clear.
Yes. What happened?
Your voice is not clear, ma'am. Some disturbances are
Is
there.
it clear now? Just a second. Can you hear now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Please continue.
Okay. Okay, fine. Okay. So Understanding Drama was written in collaboration with Robert Haleman. And these works are regarded as the landmarks in the history of literary criticism. When you consider literary criticism, these books are considered to be a landmark. Understanding Poetry, Understanding Fiction, and Understanding Drama. Brooks' critical theory is largely based on Eliot, Richards, Anson, and Coleridge. So when we talk about Clint Brooks, his works When we study about an author, we always look into the influence that author had. Brooks' critical theory is largely based on who or he got ideas, he got influenced by T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, William Emerson, and S.G. Coleridge. The Well Wrote Urn, 1947. This is very important book of Brooks, The Well Wrote Urn. And now the essay, The Language of Paradox. It was first published in 1942. Was first published in 1942 in The Language of Poetry, a journal published by Princeton University Press. The Language of Poetry. This journal was published by Princeton University Press, and Language of Paradox first appeared in this journal. Subsequently, it appeared in a slightly revised form as the first chapter of Brooks' The Well-Wrote Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry, 1947. And later it came in the came as a first chapter. At first, it was published as an essay in the journal, and later it was published, it was revised to form a first chapter in the book, The Well-Wrote Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry. This is the full name of the book, and it was published in 1947. Brooks here establishes that the language of poetry is the language of paradox. Brooks says that language of poetry is language of paradox. He illustrates the viewpoint through an analysis of the poems of Wordsworth and Donne, who have very little in common with each other. So what Brooks does is, he is trying to explain this idea. The language of poetry is the language of paradox. So he's trying to illustrate these idea through analysis of the poems of Wordsworth and Donne. He takes poems of Wordsworth and Donne and he analyzes them on the basis of this idea. See, Wordsworth and Donne belongs to two different groups, right? Donne is a metaphysical poet. Wordsworth is a romantic poet. So they have very less in common with each other. And he's trying to take two different poets or poetic form, and he's trying to explain the idea. The language of paradox is a typical new critical essay. In that, it seeks a formula or category with which to identify and define the literary language as a special kind of language not accessible to science and scientific discourse. So in this essay, what he is trying to do is, he is trying to define literary language. So if you analyze the literature and the science book, you know the difference, right? Literature contains a lot of imagination and science is based on facts. That is the basic or straight point classification or distinction between literary language and scientific language. Both are different. So he is defending, he is supporting literary language, and he says that this is a special language and it is not accessible to science. Science does not understand this. It cannot be used in science. This is only applicable to literature. So he's trying to defend the literary language. So I am talking about language of paradox, language of paradox. So what is paradox? Paradox is a device for contrasting the conventional view of a situation. So when you say something, we are contrasting that idea or the limited and special view of art, such as those taken in practical and scientific discourse with a more inclusive form. It is a self-contradictory statement or a statement which brings together opposite ideas, which however conveys some essential truth. See, paradox means when you say a statement and in the next you are contradictory, it becomes a self-contradictory statement. That is, you are bringing two opposite ideas together. The both ideas will be true. It conveys some essential truth, and you are bringing those two opposite ideas together. The same statement, it is contradictory. It goes contrary to what is accepted. It may be apparently absurd and fantasies, but deep perusal reveals that it is essentially true. So at the basic level, it appears as very absurd. It appears as very fantasy. But in the deep level, there is some essential truth in that. Okay. So first, if you're talking about paradox, you need to know what an irony is. So irony is an indirect way of conveying meaning. You say something, but it means something else, which you say something in a way that people realize that you really mean the opposite of what you say. For example, I am saying you are welcome. You do something and I say you are welcome. In an ironic sense, it is you are unwelcome. It's the opposite of what you say. That is irony. Did you understand? Do you want me to repeat?
No, ma'am.
Okay. An example of paradox. You might have heard this. This is the beginning of the end. The beginning is the end. It's a very famous line. It's an example of paradox. How can a beginning be an end? Beginning and end are two opposite ideas, right? So the statement itself is self-contradictory. So that is paradox. You're bringing two opposite ideas together in a sentence. Whereas irony, you are saying something, but it means something else. It's an indirect way of conveying means, not a direct way. You say you are welcome, but it means you are unwelcome. That is irony. Irony is the instrument of sarcasm and satire. So it is making fun of someone, or you are making a you're pointing out something that happened. You're pointing out and say that this is not the way. So it's an ironic statement, means it contains sarcasm and satire. Paradox may simply arouse wonder or irony. So when we talk about paradox, it arouses wonder. So the beginning is the end. So it is a wonder, because how can a beginning be an end? So it's an irony also. Irony and wonder are the attributes of a paradox. Very important. The two attributes of paradox are irony and wonder. When you say a paradoxical statement, it arouses irony and wonder. It is generally assumed that paradox is intellectual, clever, and rational, hence not the forte of poetry. So usually there is this misconception that it is not a forte of poetry. We cannot use paradox in poetry because paradox is highly intellectual. It's very clever and it's very rational. So it's not possible to use in poetry. It is also regarded as a language of sophistry, hard, bright, and witty, but not the language of soul. So paradox is generally considered as not a language of soul and not a forte of poetry. We cannot use it in poetry because it does not represent the soul. But Brooks is arguing against the statement, and Brooks says that paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry. So Brooks says that paradox is essential, or paradox is an appropriate form of using appropriate language in representing poetry. It's inevitable to poetry. Whenever you take a poem, whoever the poet may be, whenever you take a poem, it has paradox in it. It's inevitable to poetry. While the language of science is free from any trace of paradox, the language of poetry is paradoxical. So Brooks is saying that language of science, when you take a scientific work, it does not contain any paradox. Is it possible to use paradox in a fact-based book? For example, you're representing a theory in physics. Page number is 92, 93. And we are discussing Brooks, the language of paradox. Yeah. So when you're representing a fact-based book, for example, of Newton's law, you might have be familiar with Newton's law in physics. Can you use language of paradox? Can you use contradictory statement? No, right? It is based on experiment and it's a proven fact. In scientific work, we cannot use any paradoxical statements. Whereas in the language of poetry, you can use paradox. It's full of paradoxical statements. This is what Brooks says. Is it clear? Did you understand what is paradox and what is irony? Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Wordsworth's use of paradox. So I told you, Brooks is analyzing the poems of Wordsworth and Donne. If you have textbook, you can refer to page 93 and 94, where he is taking examples from poems of Wordsworth. So Wordsworth's use of paradox, Brooks refers to Wordsworth's poetry and establishes that even such a simple and direct poet as Wordsworth cannot avoid using the language of paradox. Means Wordsworth's poem contains paradox. There are paradoxical statements in the poems of Wordsworth. Here he is giving an example of Wordsworth's poems. It's a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. He says that this is a paradoxical statement. On a calm and quiet evening, the poet goes out into nature with a simple and innocent girl. The poet is filled with worship to the nature, but the girl by his side is not. The paradox in this poem, you can refer to the textbook. The paradox in the poem says that though the girl does not worship, she is no less divine. God is still hard. It is due to her unconscious sympathy for all of nature, not merely the grandiose and solemn. So there is a girl, innocent girl, walking along with poet, and poet says that it's very calm and quiet evening, and I am going with this girl into the nature. And poet is filled with worship, but the girl is not filled with worship. The paradox is that even though the girl does not worship, does not she is divine. Okay, if we do does not mean we let God is there for everyone. That is this. Brooke, it is from the paradoxical situation poem arises. Or Brooks is saying that poem emerges, or poem arises paradoxical situation. In a sense, paradox is very, very important in a poem, it is, it arises from paradox. You 93, 94, where you have of Wordsworth.
Sorry for interruption, ma'am. The voice is not clear, ma'am. Ma'am, connections lost.
Sorry, there was a small issue with my network. Okay, Just give me 1 second. Hello? Yeah, today the network availability is a bit problematic. Okay, let me continue because I can't. I have to wait for them to make me a co-host again so that I have to press send. I will go on with our PPT, and once they make me the co-host, I will press send. You can hear me, right?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I will wait till be a co-host. Yeah. So I was talking about Wordsworth's poetic example called Brooks was taking examples of Wordsworth and he is describing about language of paradox.
Voice is not clear, ma'am.
Next, this is not clear. Now,
Yes.
is it clear now?
No, actually,
Can you
it's
hear me?
making some musical sound to like that.
Oh, musical sound. What about now?
It's coming, ma'am. But in between of the two sentences, it's going and coming back.
Oh, okay. My network.
Your voice is broken, ma'am.
What about now?
Oh, okay, ma'am.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. So if you can't hear, okay. I just text a message then.
I think these sounds are coming from some other one's mic, not from ma'am's.
Oh, okay. Is it my fan? Now I just want to make sure it's not mine. Is it? Can you hear now?
No,
Is there
ma'am.
any disturbance?
No, ma'am.
No.
Actually,
Okay,
it's
fine.
from your side only. All are in mute position.
I think it's a
Almost.
network problem,
Yeah,
ma'am.
yeah, yeah. It might be the network problem. Yeah, my internet connection is a bit unstable.
So,
Can you hear? Us? Just let me know. Now, is it clear now? Can
Not clear, ma'am. Again, that Musical sound is coming too. Tune sound is coming.
You're not at all, ma'am. You may continue, please.
Now, now I changed my connection. Is it clear now?
No, ma'am, it's not audible.
Not audible. Just give me a second. Let me. What about now?
Yeah,
Clear,
somewhat clear, ma'am.
Fine. Okay. So, the romantic preoccupation with paradox. How romantic use paradox. The program of the romantic movement out by Wordsworth and Coleridge was itself paradoxical. So, some of the famous romantic writers, Coleridge and Wordsworth, they also use paradox. The poem was really good. The prosaic was really poetic. So the romantic writers used paradox to show that whatever it is common, it's uncommon. And whatever is prosaic, it is actually poetic. Everything is poetic and everything is uncommon. That is what the romantic writers want to say. Interpret the lyrical Wordsworth says that the ideal purpose is to choose and yeah, I became the co-host. Okay. PPT is visible, no?
Yes,
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 it's
ma'am.
visible.
Romantic paradox. Uh, Wordsworth says that he wants to or incidents and situations from common life. The common life and treat as unusual, common incidents and treating them from an unexpected. Romantics had a preoccupation with wonder. The romantic voice again. I think you can hear me now. I don't know. Yeah. So the romantics had a preoccupation with wonder. They say they wanted to arouse. Voice is breaking. Okay, I will. Can you hear me now? Can you hear now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, so yeah. The romantic preoccupation with paradox. I was talking about how Wordsworth, how Brooke was saying, Wordsworth and Coleridge uses paradoxical statement in their form. So he says that they take unusual or common or everyday life situations from common life or everyday life situations were taken and they were treated from an unusual aspect. And romantics had a preoccupation with wonder. So the basic idea of romantic poetry is to arouse wonder in the reader, the surprise, the revelation, which puts a tarnished familiar world into a light. The world will be familiar, and they are trying to bring in an element of surprise and revelation in that world. So that is the romantic preoccupation with paradox. Through the use of paradox, the writer or the romantic writers are trying to bring the idea of wonder. Next is neoclassical use of paradox. Neoclassical, you know what neoclassical poetry is. We already discussed in the previous class. In the neoclassical poetry, they wanted to, what they did, they wanted to bring in reason. They gave importance to the reason. So Brooks points out that neoclassical writers also used paradox. While romantics used it to arouse wonder, the neoclassics used it to produce irony. See how these people use differently. In romantic period, they used paradox to arouse wonder, and in the neoclassical movement, the neoclassical writers used it to produce irony. We have the textbook in page 95. There's a line for the essay on man. And Brooks is describing how Pope uses paradox in this. Other poets want irony as a base of very important with the repeated. Is it stuck or did it? I'm sorry to having a very bad network problem. I don't know. It's very the point. Remember this wonder and irony. Why irony are very important. These are the base paradox. Paradox aroused by irony. Wonder and irony merge to form the paradoxes in many Coleridge and Gray. Not only the romantic and Coleridge and Pope use, there are other like Gray or paradox, and the one paradox is because they want to use wonder and irony. So this is how the other poets use. Next is poetry and science. This is very simple because you can know what is the language poetry, what is the language definition, right? The both language. Poetic work if you take a poetry, is the language of poem as the language of science or facts? The language is entirely different. Brooks holds that am I audible?
Sorry, ma'am, you're
You
not audible, ma'am.
Yes.
It's very disturbing noises is coming, ma'am.
Right now it's also it's still
No, actually, ma'am, the every second sentence
I
or
mean,
word, the voice is unclear.
okay. What about now? What about now?
Same, ma'am.
Same. I mean, you can't hear me at all.
Your voice is
Yeah.
coming, but not clear.
Now
Some
it's
network
okay,
issue, ma'am.
madam. Here it is very clear, madam. No problem. Sometimes now we are getting some kind of disturbance.
Okay. So when you get the disturbance, please leave a message
you're not
or
clear,
just
ma'am.
cut me in and say that you're not clear. Oh, no. This is the best that I can do right now. My wife. I mean, my network has range though, but I don't know why you can't hear me. Still not. Hello? So voice is clear, right? But there is a disturbance when I talk. Okay, I have a very bad network issue. Tomorrow I will resolve this issue.
Okay, ma'am.
So for today, just bear with me because I have to finish the portion. I don't know. Today my network issue is very network connectivity is very bad. So still you can see the PPT, right? Let's just go with that. I'll go very slow. So I think if I'm going fast, you won't get anything. I'll go very slow. So I hope you will get it. Language of poetry and language of science both are different. See, when you say language of poetry, the poem uses a different language, right? The language of imagination. Whereas the language of science is different. In science, what happens? It's fact-based. The language is fact-based. Fact-based in the sense that it is a theory, experimentally proven. So you can't use any imagination when you say anything fact-based. So Brooks says that paradox spring from very nature of poet's language. Paradox originates from the language used by poet. Whoever the poet is, the language emerges. So what Brooks is this? Whoever the poet is, the language used by the poet gives rise to paradox. It is the poetic language that gives rise to paradox. In scientific language, there is no paradox at all. There is no traces of paradox in a scientific language. So there are connotation and denotation. And in poetic language, we can see scientific language. It's very fixed and rigid. You can't use any ideas, or you can't use any uh, subjective science in a scientific language. Whereas in a poetry, you can use imagination, you can use subjective ideas. So there's a difference between the language of poetry and language of science. And language of science is very fixed, whereas poetry, there's an alteration of language. You can change the language. You can change the language in such a way the reader can interpret different meanings. I read a poetry and it will be different when you read it. The poet uses words which are new, and they combine different words to form a new word. But in science, it is not possible. In a scientific language, each word has its own meaning. You can't like use different words. Whereas in poetry, you can use one word and a same word has different meanings. In poetry, they continually modify each other and thus violate the dictionary meaning. See, in a poem, when you use a word, it not necessarily the dictionary meaning. It changes. Right? When you say a word, it changes. The meaning changes. So, in a sense, they are paradoxical. Paradoxical as in the meaning is entirely different. It is not always the dictionary meaning in poetry. Next is Donne's canonization. This is illustrating Donne's canonization as an example based on paradox and irony. The very title of the poem reflects a basic metaphor, canonization. It's usually related with religion and Christianity. But here, the canonization here is not related to Christianity. He is considering a love as divine. He is bringing love, the theme of love, to a religious epitome. Okay, the very title reflects a basic metaphor which underlies a paradox of treating profane love as it is a divine love. The canonization here is not of the saints who have renounced the world and the flesh, but of the lovers who do not renounce the world and whose hermitage is each other's body. The saints, usually what they do is they give away the world and flesh, they give away their desires, and they try to live in along with the God. But here, the lovers, what they do is they do not denounce the world, and their home or hermitage is each other's body. So, usually when you say lovers cannot be considered as a canonization, you cannot say they are canonized. It's actually for highly spiritual and religious thing. And here the poet is trying to bring love into a divine love. One wonders where it is parody of Christian sainthood. We think that okay, it is a parody of Christian sainthood, and we say that Donne does not take love and religion seriously. But when you closely analyze the poem, we can understand that Donne takes both religion and love seriously, and that it is not parody of Christian sainthood. So when you understand the paradox in the poem, you can understand that it is not a parody. This is what Donne's canonization is, and how Bruce analyzed Donne's canonization. Next is creative imagination. A paradox is a fusion or union of opposite ideas. So I said paradox, the same sentence, you have opposite ideas. So paradox is a fusion or union of opposite ideas or discordant elements brought about by creative imagination of the poet. So a paradox is brought together by a creative imagination of the poet. The fusion is not logical. So when you if you look for a logical reason, there won't be any logic in the paradoxical statement. It apparently violates science and common sense. The paradox violates common sense and science. It's not logical at all. Shakespeare's view of paradox. What is Shakespeare's view of paradox? Oh, I'm sorry. Shakespeare's view of paradox. So Shakespeare also uses paradox. Reason and intellectual separate and divine, while imagination unites. So according to Shakespeare, if you are taking reason and intellect, it separates poetry, but imagination unites the elements of poetry. Reason and intellect separates the elements of poetry, divides the elements of poetry, whereas imagination unites the element of poetry. If Shakespeare's poem is taken as an instant of that magic power, while Coleridge sought to describe it, it offers useful insights into poetry. So it says, paradox gives insight to poetry. When you analyze a poem, there are paradox. And this, if you can understand the paradox, you will understand what the poetry is all about, what the poet is trying to describe in the poem. This is what Shakespeare's view of paradox is. And in the textbook, there's a critique of the essay. You can just read it. It's not that very important. You can just read it, how the essay is being criticized. So this is all about Brooks. Is it clear? Did you understand? Did you hear anything? Am I still not audible? Am I still not audible? Can you hear?
Yes, madam.
We are going to analyze the next essay. Sorry, next unit. We have completed block 2. In block 2, we discussed Matthew Arnold's tradition of criticism, function of criticism in the present time. Discussed T.S. Eliot's tradition and individual talent, I.A. Richard's 4 kinds of meaning, and Clement Brooks' the language of paradox. Now, moving on to block 3, here we are going to analyze critical approaches. What are the different critical approach to literature? This is a very simple way of explanation. So I have only pointed out the major points. Critical approaches to literature. What is critical approach? What do you mean by critical approach? So critical reading of literature presupposes some knowledge of literature and critical tools on the part of the critic, and involves a serious and systematic attempt to understand, analyze, interpret, assess, and sometimes judge a work of art. When you're trying to do a critical reading of any work, you have to have some knowledge. You have to have some knowledge on literature. You should know. You should be familiar with some critical tools, and with that, you try to understand the text, analyze the text, interpret the text, assess the text, and judge a work of art. That is critical approach. The purpose or goal of a critical approach is set by the critic based on the special area of knowledge he uses to understand, assess a work. So there are different ways of approaching a text. There are different ways of understanding a text. Based on different ways, the purpose or the goal of the critic is set. There are 5 major critical approaches to literature. They are the moralistic approach, the psychological approach, the sociological approach, the archetypal approach, and formalistic approach. There are 5 major approaches, and we are going to analyze, we are going to understand what is the meaning of each approach. What are the critics doing in each kind of approach? That is what we are going to discuss. First is the moralistic approach. Moralistic. So that's something related with the moral. The moralistic critic judges a work of art based on its purpose. So the critic is analyzing the purpose of the text, especially its moral purpose and significance, and the message it gives to the society. The moralistic approach says that if there's a text, the text should have a moral purpose and it should give a message to the society. The text should give a message to the society. That is the moralistic approach. The critic judges a work of art based on its purpose, especially the moral purpose, and the text should have a message to the society. That is moralistic approach. Who will be the people who use moralistic approach? Which kind of poets will be using moralistic approach? The neoclassical writers, right? The neoclassical writers usually use the moralistic approach. Next is psychological approach. Psychological. The psychological critique is influenced by the researches of Freud's theory of unconscious of man and his libidinous compulsions, and Jung's theory of collective unconscious. So psychological approach is based on Sigmund Freud and Jung. Freud and Jung. These two. Okay, who's somebody's? So this is the psychological approach is basically, it's based on the research works done by Freud and Carl Jung. Theory of unconscious of man and his libidinous compulsion, and the theory of collective unconscious. Based on these two this psychological approach is formed. Psychology has with a more precise language and help him to probe the interior life of the writer and then to study his work with reference to it. So what this approach does is they're trying to understand the interior life of the writer. They are understanding the interior life of the writer, the psychology of the writer, and they're trying to understand with reference to the writer. So in the psychological approach, they are giving importance to the writer. This helps him in a better understanding and more exact interpretation of the art. So when the critic is trying to understand a literary work based on the writer's psychology, it helps the critic to understand and interpret the text more accurately. Okay, now the unexplained motives of characters in fiction, which are quite puzzling, are explained away through the analysis of the substance of the artist. So there will be certain fictional works like novels, short stories, where we have characters who have unexplained motives. The motives of the characters will be not explained properly. It's quite puzzling. So it is the duty of the reader to find out what exactly the characters are. What exactly is the character trying to do in the fiction? So if the critics have a clear understanding about the artist, what are the subconscious repressions of the artist, then they will be able to understand the characters better. That is what the psychological approach is. Through the psychoanalytic theories, the critic is trying to understand the text. That is psychological approach. So next is sociological approach. So we discussed what a moralistic approach is. And next, psychological approach. And next is a sociological approach. Sociological, it is related to the society. The sociological critic tries to understand the social milieu and judge the writer on the basis of his response to it. Sociological approach, here what the critic does is they try to understand the society, the social happenings, what is happening in the society. What are the major issues or what are the major incidents happening in the society, and with that they judge the writer. They judge the writer based on the writer's response to the society. Each social period has its own characteristic features, and the writers of each period should understand the society, and they should represent or they should respond to the social milieu. That is what sociological approach does. Here, the critique is trying to understand the society, and with that, they are trying to judge the writer. They are trying to judge the writer based on their response to the society. That is what sociological approach is. The next is archetypal approach. Archetypal. Here, the archetypal critic, what he does is he tries to trace some basic cultural pattern of universal meaning and appeal to humanity in a work of art. It reflects the contemporary interest in myth. It gives importance to myth. Archetypal symbols. They give importance to archetypal symbols. And these symbols are originated from the culture. This is based on the cultural pattern. And the cultural pattern emphasizes a universal meaning. It tries to bring out a universal meaning. So the archetypal critic, what they do is they try to understand the culture. They try to understand what is the culture and how it represents a meaning. And through that, they are understanding a text. The basic interest is in myth. So, is it clear? Archetypal approach. Do you want me to repeat it, or should we move forward?
No, ma'am.
Yes, yes, ma'am. I want to know once again, ma'am.
Once again, okay. The archetypal approach is based on myth. There are myths based in each culture. We know that there are different cultures, and in each culture, they have different types of meanings. And these meanings are brought by the writers, and they represent that to their fiction. To their fictional work, the writers are trying to represent the culture through which they are bringing a universal meaning. And that is what the archetypal approach is. The archetypal critics are tracing the culture in each text. They take a text and what the cultural pattern is. See, the moralistic approach, the critics will be analyzing some moral function. In the psychological approach, they are analyzing the inner psychology of the writers, giving importance to the writers. And in the sociological approach, they are giving importance to the society. In the same way, in the archetypal approach, they are giving importance to the culture. It's very simply, you can understand that they are analyzing the culture, the myths, and through that, they are trying to understand the text. That is what our archetypal criticism is. Okay. Now, next is the formalistic approach. The formalistic approach, formalistic form, based on the form of the text. The formalistic approach is one of the most influential approaches of criticism of the early 20th century. So this emerged in the early 20th century, and it is one of the influential approach in literary criticism. It emphasized more on the form and technique of literature. Here, They are basically giving importance to the form, how the text is written, what are the different techniques used in the text. Okay, the formalistic approach is regarded as an intrinsic approach because it considers the form as a form, but not as a reflection of extrinsic factors such as history, society, psychology, or poet's life. Remember, I have explained what an intrinsic approach in the previous classes. In intrinsic approach, analyzing the internal aspects of the text, the form, structure, language. That is the intrinsic approach. The extrinsic approach is the external factors such as the history, society, biography of the writer, poet's life or their psychology. All these are extrinsic factors. So formalistic approach basically gives importance to the intrinsic. They are not understanding a text from its history. They're not understanding a text from the society of that period. They're not analyzing the writer. They're not analyzing any of the external factors. They're giving importance to the text itself. Remember, in the last class, we discussed about an experiment. When we discussed about I.A. Richards, we discussed about an experiment where the writer, he gives a piece of writing to his students in practical criticism. How he gave a writing piece to the students and making them understand it. He conceals the external details, conceals the details of the writer. The students only have that literary piece to analyze, and how the analysis is done. That is a formalistic approach. So you can say new criticism comes under formalistic approach, which we will be discussing in the next slide. The new criticism is a formalistic approach. Now, synthesis. Before that, apart from these 5 approaches, remember the approaches: formalistic approach, psychological approach, sociological approach, archetypal approach, and formalistic approach. Apart from these, there are some other post-new critical approaches. Certain post-new critical approaches like structuralism, deconstruction, reader response theory, feminism, post-colonialism, etc. So no single approach can be valid in the analysis of literature because it cannot answer all the legitimate questions that can be asked of a literary work of art. The critic may choose a critical approach or a synthesis of critical approach depending on the nature of the text under study. So what the critic does is, he can't just go and take, they can't answer, they cannot answer all the legitimate questions. The approach is taken by the critic based on the text under study. They take a text, based on the text, they take the appropriate critical approach. And with that critical approach, they are analyzing the text. For example, if you take a text, if you are using moralistic approach, you can't just use a moralistic approach, right? There is scope for other approaches also. So a text can be analyzed from any approach we have, but the critic takes the appropriate method of analyzing the text. It's based on the critic. This is about the different critical approaches. I hope it's clear. Remember the 5 critical approach: the moralistic, psychological, sociological, archetypal, and formalistic approach, and try to understand what each approach says. What is the basic idea behind each approach? The moralistic approach, it is the moral essence of the text. In psychological approach, it is the inner life of the writer. In sociological approach, it is the writer's response to the milieu. In the archetypal approach, it is based on the myth. understanding the culture based in the text. In the formalistic approach, they understand the form and technique in the text, the intrinsic factors in the text. This is basically the different critical approaches. Clear? Now we have to move on to new criticism. I was saying the term new criticism from onwards, right? So we will see what new criticism is, who are the major practitioners of new criticism, and what are they trying to analyze in a text. The origin, how, when, and where new criticism emerged. The new criticism is a formalistic movement. I just said it. It is a formalistic movement which found its seed in the first quarter of the 20th century. The new criticism emerged in the 20th century and blossomed with the publication of by John Crow Ransom in 1941. So, new criticism with the publication of the new criticism, the essay. The essay's name is The New Criticism, Crow Ransom, and was published in 1941. The new criticism emerged as a revolt against the Impressionism and relativism. It's a revolt against Impressionism and relativism. An intrinsic approach to literature with its emphasis on close scrutiny of the text. See, they are what the new critics does. They understand the text. It's close reading of the text. They analyze every aspect of the text. The intrinsic aspects. What is the form? What is the structure? What are the different techniques used in the text? What is the language used in the text? Those intrinsic factors are given importance, and they attack the excessive use of extrinsic factors. The new critics rejects the extrinsic factors. Remember the term, okay, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic is the internal aspects of the text. Extrinsic is the external aspects of the text. The external aspects include history, psychology, biography, and sociology. The history of the period, the biography of the writer, the psychological aspects of the writer, the social conditions of the period, all these factors are rejected. I am repeating this again because this is very important. The intrinsic approach and rejecting the extrinsic factors is the basic idea of new criticism. And this is the new criticism is very important from an exam point of view.
Ma'am, one doubt, ma'am.
Yes.
Can we say extrinsic is not part of the nature, or intrinsic is a part of the nature, or which belonging naturally?
It's not like belonging naturally. See, I didn't understand your question. It's actually not related to nature. It's an approach, right? It's an approach towards the text. These are different elements in a literature. Like when you write a literary book, when there's a literary text, there will be a writer. And the text will be based on a period, a particular time period. Then we have the social condition of that time period. We have the history of that period. And when we take the writer, we understand the psychology, biography of the writer. These are the elements of a literature. Along with the text, what a text is, the structure, how the text is written, the form of the text, the structure of the text, the techniques used. For example, when you take a poem, it has different elements like the stanza, division of the stanza. We have the figures of speech. All those are intrinsic factors. The poet, the time period, all those are extrinsic factors. Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am, got it, ma'am.
Okay. And the new criticism had its genesis in the fugitive group meetings and the journal of the same name in the Vanderbilt University at Nashville, USA. See, fugitive group. I already explained what a fugitive group is in the previous slide. Who are the members of the fugitive group that I explained? We have John Crow, Ransom, Alan Tate as in the fugitive group members, and new criticism emerged in the fugitive group. The idea of new criticism emerged in the group meetings, the fugitive group meetings, and they had a journal of the same name, which was published under Vanderbilt University at Nashville, USA. So this is the basic idea about the origin of new criticism. And we have the predecessors of new criticism. When new criticism shaped its form, when new criticism as a critical movement came into being, there were predecessors. There were writers before that who pointed towards this idea. Examples of those were T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, William Emerson, and T.E. Hull. So T.S. Eliot, we already discussed his idea about poetry. I hope you remember poetry is not the turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. We discussed it in detail. So T.S. Eliot gave idea about, see, T.S. Eliot, if you remember, we have already discussed it, how he rejected emotion. He said that there is no space of emotions in the poetic form. There is no need of expressing emotion in the poetry. It does not represent the personality of the writer. It is an escape from emotion. It is an escape from personality. It's just a medium. We also discussed about how a poet is a catalyst in the poetic process. I hope you remember because we already discussed it. Okay, so his idea about objective correlation all points towards the new critical approach. And then we have I.A. Richards. Again, we already discussed I.A. Richards, 4 kinds of meaning: sense, feeling, tone, and intention, which is important in poetry. We already discussed it. So I.A. Richards' idea also point towards new criticism. We were said that actually new criticism, how new criticism began with I.A. Richards. So I'm not going to repeat it because we have already completed it. You can refer to the previous classes to get a better understanding of T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards. Next is William Emerson. William also also contributed to new criticism. His concept of ambiguity. William Emerson describes about ambiguity and how a word has different meanings. He wrote a famous essay, 7 Ambiguity. It's a famous book by William Emerson where he says that a text have multiple meanings. A text can have multiple meanings. Next is T.E. Hulme. T. Hulme, he also argued against the use of extrinsic factors. He said that the aim of language should be very accurate. It should be that is what T.E. Hulme talked about. See, actually, you have to remember the names, the predecessors, T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, William Emerson, and T.E. Hulme, and the basic idea what they are trying to say. T.S. Eliot, what he did is he rejected the idea of using emotions in the book. I.A. Richards also distinguished 4 kinds of meaning and how he said poetry should be what are the sense, feeling, tone, and intention used in poetry. Then we have William Emerson. He used ambiguity and said that each text has different kinds of meaning. So it is the reader's duty to identify the meanings in the text. Then we have T.E. Hulme, and what he did is what he did is he described that in a literary work, the language should be very accurate, it should be very precise, it should give definite descriptions. So through these writers, they are paved the way to new criticism, and new criticism emerged in the early first half of the 20th century. It is a very important approach or movement in literary criticism. The new criticism dominated the American literary criticism from the first quarter of the 20th century to the late 1960s. Brooks and Penn Warren, again we discussed it, Clent Brooks and Robert Penn Warren, their works, Understanding Poetry and Understanding Fiction. These are the basic works of new criticism. We are actually repeating what we have discussed in the previous units. The new criticism seeks to be an objective and independent approach to literature. It's very objective. They do not include any subjective elements. It should be very objective. The writers should be detached from the text. And it is an independent approach to literature. Here, again, a poem is seen as a poem and not anything else. They analyze a poem as a poem without any external factors. Here, the poet is not considered important. The poet is not important in analyzing a poem. According to new critics, the poet should be objective. The poet should be, even if we remove the poet, even if we do not know who the poet is, the reader should be able to understand a poetry. The new criticism is an intrinsic approach to literature as it looks the text for analysis, not to other extrinsic factors. A text is analyzed with the intrinsic elements, giving importance to the intrinsic elements and not the extrinsic factors. So till here, these are the points we already discussed from the first class onwards. Now, the new criticism is opposed to the use of intention and poetic effect as measuring rods of criticism. Intention and poetic effect. I.A. Richards was talked about intention and poetic effects. Again, I hope you remember. And we have another writers like Wimsatt and Beardsley. And they have a very famous essay called The Intentional Fallacy and Affective Fallacy, where they reject poetic effort. They dismiss intention and poetic effect as a critical fallacy. The new critics, what they concerned it is that the poet's intention is not important in analyzing a text. Intention here is the poet's intention. The poet will have an intention in writing a poetry. The poet have their own ideas why they are writing a poetry, which is not important. We do not need to know what the poet's intention is. The critics, they do not judge a poem based on the effect it has on the reader. See, the poetic effect is not important. The intention is not important. The new critics are opposing use of intention. The poet's intention in writing a poetry is not important in analyzing the poem. The poetic effect that has on the reader. The poem has an effect on the reader, which is also not important in judging a poem. That is what new critics are saying. Next, the new criticism is opposed to the romantic theory of poetry and criticism. Obviously, we know that how romantic writers described a poetry. So, according to romantic writers, it is the poets said that the poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. We discussed about it, how the emotions are being discussed, how they gave importance to emotions. So obviously, new criticism will be opposing the romantic idea. Right here, they are not giving importance to emotion. So the theory of poetry by the romantic writers, it is the new critics are opposing it. The new critics believe that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion. It is an escape from emotion. Poetry is not an expression of personality. It is an escape from personality. That is what the new critic says. Now, it is primarily interested in explication or close reading. Here, the text is analyzed in detail. Even the subtle aspects were analyzed. The writers, the critics give importance to the ambiguities, the multiple meanings. Ambiguity means the multiple meanings, in the text, the complex interrelation of the ideas are being analyzed by the critics. I.A. Richards' practical criticism and William Emerson's 7 types of ambiguity. This stresses the close reading approach. Remember these writings when you study each critic, in each movement, from the beginning onwards, we discuss different movements. When you study each movement, make a note of the writer's name, the critic's name, and their major works. I.A. Richards' practical criticism is important. William Emerson's 7 types of ambiguity is important. So through this, here I'm saying 7 types of ambiguity and practical criticism gave importance to the close reading approach. The principles of new criticism are basically verbal. Verbal in the sense it gave importance to the language used. See, we discussed about the language of poetry and language of science, the difference between these two languages. So here, verbal, like the language used in the poetry will be different from the language of science. In poetic language, it contains imagination, it contains subjective elements, it has figures of speech like simile, metaphor, and it uses symbols. So all these language elements will be used in the poetry. So the language, the new criticism is basically verbal in the sense they gave importance to the different elements used in the literary work. Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So new criticism does not give importance to the distinction between literary genres. We have different literary genres like novels, poetry, drama, and the new critics are not giving importance to this distinction. Okay, they're not giving importance to the distinction about how the genres are being divided. So here, what they do is they analyze the words, images, symbols which are organized around the theme. They are not analyzing the character or thought or the plot. They are they are analyzing the words, images, and symbols. They're not going into the character analysis. They're not going to the plot analysis. So the literary genre, this distinction between literary genre is not important in new criticism. And they also see that the quality of a poetry can be understood through different ideas. See, these are the major writers of critics of new criticism, and they have put forward different ideas about by how they analyze the text. Clint Brooks, irony and paradox, we already discussed. Ransom's structure and texture. Alan Tate brought tension. Anson's ambiguity. Pen Warren's simple. Richard's behavior of words. So they have put forward these ideas in their literary works in order to understand the quality of poetry. See, if we analyze the quality of poetry according to Brooks' approach, they give importance to irony and paradox. If it is Alan Tate, importance is given to tension. Anson gives importance to ambiguity. Pen Warren gives importance to symbol. So these ideas are important in understanding the quality of poetry. The next is the new critics rejects the expression theory of poetry. See, expression is the through expression, the poet is trying to bring about thoughts, feelings, but here they are not giving importance to expression. They say that the poet has nothing to express. In poetry, the poet has nothing to express. That is what new critics say, that there is nothing to express. No feelings, no thoughts, no concepts of the poet are used in poetry. They are not giving importance to that. They are giving importance to the word. What are the words used in the poetry? They're not giving importance to the thought or the concept described. Understood? So they are giving importance to the words, the language, and not the emotions or thought or the feelings. So with that, we have discussed the major idea about new criticism. We have been discussing it from the first class only. So you are familiar with what intrinsic is, what extrinsic is, what is close reading, what are the different ideas in new criticism. And next is limitation. What are the limitations of new criticism? Criticism has certain limitation because new criticism is excessively preoccupied with textual analysis, right? They're giving importance to textual analysis. The words, the imageries, the simple, they're only analyzing the textual part and they ignore the beauty of the whole. When all these elements combine together, the poem brings out a beauty of its own. They are ignoring the beauty. They are only occupied with the textual analysis. It is often dogmatic and narrow. So their close reading becomes a closed approach. They are not giving importance to the sociological, psychological aspects. So with this, they won't be having a better understanding of the work. And then overemphasizing the aesthetic function. See, all the criticism, when we discussed about neoclassical criticism, we discussed how they are giving importance to moral function, how they are preoccupied with the moral function of a literature. The same way, new critics are overemphasizing the aesthetic function. Now they are against emotion, subjective elements. These are not justified by the new critic. And then textual study can only, see, the textual analysis can only establish the literary quality of a work. When you analyze textual aspects, it brings out the literary quality of the work. The quality of the work is being analyzed, but the greatness of the work does not depend on literary quality. See, when you say a literary work is great, the greatness of the literary work cannot be analyzed by the literary quality. So this is not applicable, or this is not possible through textual analysis. They ignore the history. They ignore the history. Each literary work is based on history, right? Each work is based on history. So they are ignoring the history. These are the major limitations. So read the text once and you will get a better understanding. If you have any doubts, you can ask later. So is it clear? I hope it's clear. We discussed about, in today's class, we discussed about Clint Brooks, and then we discussed about the different literary approach, critical approaches to literature. Then we also discussed about new criticism. Read the textbook and you'll get a better understanding. Any doubts?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Okay, then we can wind up the class. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.